Most people think the Battle of Kursk was decided by tanks. It wasn't. It was decided 2 days before the largest tank battle in history even began, in the dark, by a German sapper who got captured doing something he shouldn't have been doing and told his captors something he shouldn't have told them. By the time Tiger crews at Prokhorovka were loading their first rounds, the battle was already lost. I'll tell you exactly what that sapper said and exactly what it triggered before we're done. But to understand why it mattered so much, you need to understand what the Germans were walking into and why the Soviets already knew they were coming. I'm Arthur Finch. It's the summer of 1943 on the southern Russian steppe around a city called Kursk, roughly 500 kilometers south of Moscow. The Eastern Front had a bulge in it that summer, a salient about 150 kilometers wide, jutting into German lines like a fist pushed into a wall. The Germans looked at that bulge and saw an opportunity. Cut through the base of it from north and south, pinch it shut, and you destroy something like 500,000 Soviet soldiers in one stroke. They called the plan Operation Citadel. Here's the part that almost never makes it into the popular story. The Germans had used this exact maneuver before, at Kharkov, that same spring, with brutal success. So in one sense, Citadel wasn't an act of confidence. It was an act of desperation dressed up as a plan. Hitler postponed the attack for weeks, waiting on new Panther tanks fresh from the factory floor. Machines that hadn't even finished their mechanical teething problems. Generals like Heinz Guderian told him directly that the attack made no sense, that Germany couldn't afford the losses no matter the outcome. Hitler postponed it anyway, again and again, from May into June into early July. And every single day he waited, the Soviets dug. This is where the story actually begins, not with armor, but with shovels. Soviet intelligence had known the broad shape of German intentions since April. Partly from a spy ring in Switzerland, partly from intercepted signals, partly from simple, unglamorous reconnaissance. German buildups don't hide well on open steppe. Stalin's generals, particularly Georgy Zhukov, made an argument that went against every instinct of how the Red Army had fought up to that point. Don't attack first, let them come to us. Think about what that meant in practice. The Soviets had the manpower and the political will to throw an army forward in a glorious offensive. And they chose instead to dig. 8 defensive belts, one behind another, stretching back almost 300 kilometers from the front line. Anti-tank ditches. Minefields layered so thick that in places there were over 2,500 mines per kilometer of front. Artillery positions sighted to fire into the same killing zones from multiple directions. Over 1 million civilians, mostly women, were brought in from nearby towns to dig trenches by hand, mile after mile, through the spring mud and the summer heat. Stop for a second and sit with that number. 8 defensive lines. Most armies build 1, maybe 2, and call it a day. The Soviets built 8, because Zhukov understood something the Germans hadn't fully reckoned with. That depth beats armor, if you have enough of it, and enough warning to build it. That warning is the part of this story most documentaries skip past on their way to the tank battle. And it's the part that actually decides the outcome. Keep that in mind. It matters more than it sounds like right now. By July, the Kursk salient held what might have been the most heavily fortified ground in the history of warfare to that point. Roughly 1.3 million Soviet soldiers, nearly 3,500 tanks, over 19,000 guns and mortars. Against them, the Germans brought close to 900,000 men and around 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including the new Panthers, a handful of the massive Ferdinand tank destroyers, and the Tiger ones that have since become the symbol of the entire battle in popular memory. But symbols aren't strategy. And this is where I want you to imagine, for a moment, that you are a German staff officer in early July, looking at the reconnaissance photographs coming back from the salient. You can see the trench lines, you can see the wire, you can see even from the air that this is not a position you are going to break through with speed and surprise the way the Wehrmacht had broken through Soviet lines in 1941. What do you do with that knowledge when the order to attack has already been given and Hitler has already waited as long as his patience allows? You attack anyway, because that's what happened. The plan called for the attack to begin in the early hours of July 5th. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein would drive north from the south. General Walter Model would drive south from the north. And the pincers would meet somewhere near the city of Kursk itself, sealing the trap. The German timetable depended on one thing above almost everything else: surprise about exactly when the guns would open up. Not whether the Soviets knew an attack was coming. By July, everyone on both sides understood that much. What mattered now was the hour. And this is where Bruno Formella enters the story. On the night of July 4th into July 5th, German sappers were sent forward in small parties to clear paths through Soviet minefields ahead of the main assault. Quiet, dangerous, unglamorous work that had to happen before a single tank could move. Near the village of Cherkasskoye in the sector held by the Soviet 6th Guards Army, a patrol from the 168th Soviet Rifle Division caught one of these German engineers. His name, recorded in Soviet after-action material, was Bruno Formella, a sapper attached to the 168th German Infantry Division. Under interrogation that night, he gave his captors something far more valuable than his name and rank. He told them the attack was set to begin at 3 in the morning. I'll say it again, because this is the detail the whole battle turns on. A single captured engineer handed the Soviets the exact start time of one of the largest offensives of the entire war. What happened next is the reason Kursk is remembered the way historians remember it, rather than the way Hollywood remembers it. Soviet commanders, holding that piece of intelligence, made a decision that very few armies in history have had the nerve or the artillery density to make. Before the German guns could open fire, before the infantry could even cross their own start lines, Soviet artillery let loose a massive counter-bombardment, sometimes called a spoiling attack, into the assembly areas where German troops, vehicles, and ammunition dumps were packed and waiting in the dark. Picture it from the German side for a moment. You are a tank crewman, an infantryman, an artillery loader, sitting in your jumping-off position in the last hour before an attack you've trained for and dreaded in equal measure. And the night erupts, not from your own guns opening the battle on schedule, but from Soviet shells landing precisely where you and your unit are concentrated, hours before you were supposed to be the one striking first. Confusion, casualties before the battle has technically started, communication lines cut, timetables thrown off before a single German tank track has turned. This is the part that matters. Citadel was supposed to open with the initiative entirely in German hands. Speed, concentration, surprise, the formula that had worked in 1941. Instead, it opened with the Soviets landing the first blow. On a battlefield the Soviets had spent 2 months turning into a fortress, against an enemy whose precise timing they had just been handed by a captured engineer in the dark. You'd assume that single counter-bombardment crippled the German attack outright. You'd be wrong. Not entirely, anyway. The German offensive still went forward that morning, still hit hard, still made costly progress in places, particularly in the south under Manstein. The spoiling attack didn't stop Citadel. What it did was strip away the one advantage the Germans most needed against defenses this deep: true surprise, at the exact moment they needed it most. Every hour after that, the Germans were fighting the battle the Soviets had built for them, not the battle they had planned. That's the part of Kursk that the famous footage and the famous numbers tend to bury. Yes, what followed at Prokhorovka on July 12th was a colossal, brutal collision of armor. Hundreds of tanks from both sides fighting at close range in a few square kilometers of farmland, in heat and dust and smoke so thick that crews sometimes couldn't tell friend from enemy until they were almost touching. It earned its reputation. It is, by most accountings, the largest tank engagement in the history of warfare, and the men who fought in those machines that day deserve to be remembered with the seriousness their suffering demands. Many of them did not come home, on either side, and a great many who did carried the day with them for the rest of their lives. But Prokhorovka was not the hinge the war turned on. The hinge had already swung shut a week earlier, in the dark, near a village most people have never heard of, because of a captured sapper and a barrage that opened before the German guns ever got the chance. Wait, there's a wider context here that makes Formella's capture even more consequential than it looks in isolation. The Soviet defensive plan at Kursk wasn't improvised in response to one lucky interrogation. It was built, methodically, over months, on the assumption that intelligence and depth could substitute for the kind of fast, decisive armored offensive the Germans were famous for. Zhukov's strategic memorandum to Stalin in April had argued exactly this, that it would be better to wear the German offensive down on prepared defenses, bleed their armored reserves white, and only then launch Soviet counteroffensives with fresh reserves while the Wehrmacht's best tank divisions were spent. That's a patient, almost unglamorous theory of how to win a battle. It does not photograph well. There's no thundering charge in it, no single moment for a newsreel camera. It looks, from a distance, like waiting. But waiting, when you've used the time to dig 8 defensive belts and you have an exact 3 a.m. start time handed to you by an enemy combat engineer, becomes something else. It becomes the single most decisive use of intelligence in the entire campaign. Within days, the German offensive in the north under Model had effectively stalled against the depth of Soviet defenses around Poniry and Olkhovatka, what some historians have called a second Stalingrad in miniature, fought over rail junctions and fortified villages rather than a single city. In the south, Manstein's forces pushed further, harder, all the way to Prokhorovka. But even there, by mid-July, German losses in tanks, fuel and trained crews had reached a point that could not be sustained, especially with Allied landings in Sicily on July 10th pulling Hitler's attention and his reserves toward the Mediterranean. On July 13th, Hitler called off Citadel, not because the Wehrmacht had been annihilated on the battlefield in some single catastrophic blow, but because the entire operation had been bleeding out, slowly and irreversibly, since the moment the Soviets fired first. Let me take you to one specific place inside that northern fight, because numbers and army names can blur together if you let them, and this battle deserves better than that. Poniry was a small railway town, the kind of place that exists because a train line needed a station, not because anyone planned it to matter. In July of 1943, it became one of the most fought-over patches of ground on the Eastern Front. Soviet defenders there were dug in so thoroughly, with anti-tank guns sighted in such overlapping fields of fire, that German soldiers who survived the fighting started calling it the Second Stalingrad. Not because the scale matched the siege of that city, but because the house-to-house, building-to-building character of the fighting felt the same. Tanks of the German 18th Panzer Division and infantry from the Soviet 13th Army fought for days over a tractor station, a school, a grain elevator. Ordinary buildings turned into strong points, fought over room by room, sometimes changing hands more than once in a single day. Soviet sources describe Red Army soldiers using Molotov cocktails against German armor at close range, when anti-tank guns ran short of ammunition, climbing onto tanks under fire to drop explosives through hatches. This wasn't the open, sweeping tank duel of popular memory. This was claustrophobic, brutal and slow, and it ground the German 9th Army's offensive down to a near standstill days before Hitler made his final decision to call off the operation entirely. Listen to this, because it's easy to miss. The Germans had planned Citadel as a battle of movement, fast panzer spearheads punching through weak points and racing toward each other behind Soviet lines. The same formula that had worked devastatingly well in 1941. What they got at places like Poniry was the opposite of movement. They got attrition, fought meter by meter, against defenders who had been given 2 months to decide exactly where the Germans would be forced to die. Now, go back with me to where that defensive advantage actually came from. Because it didn't start with shovels. It started with information, and the Soviets had more of it than most accounts give them credit for. Beyond the simple visibility of German build-ups on open ground, Soviet intelligence had been receiving detailed reports for months from a network of agents operating out of neutral Switzerland, a ring later known to historians as the Lucy spy network, whose information is believed by some scholars to have ultimately originated from British code-breaking of German Enigma traffic, laundered through intermediaries so its true source stayed hidden. Historians still debate exactly how much of the Kursk planning data reached Moscow through that specific channel versus other sources, and Soviet archives on the subject remain incomplete to this day. But what isn't in serious dispute is that by late spring, Soviet High Command had a remarkably accurate picture of German intentions. Not just that an attack was coming, but roughly where the pincers would fall. That's the foundation Formella's information landed on. Not a guess, not a hunch. A strategic picture built from months of patient intelligence work, refined at the very last moment by one frightened man's answer to a very specific question in the dark. What time? Let's go to Prokhorovka itself for a moment, because if I tell you about the scale of that fight without telling you about a single human being inside it, I haven't really told you anything. On the morning of July 12th, in the fields southwest of that small town, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov drove forward into German armor from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. The terrain there wasn't the open, sweeping steppe you might picture. It was broken up by gullies, a rail embankment, scattered orchards, a small river called the Psel, terrain that, in places, forced tanks into ranges of a few hundred meters or less, sometimes close enough that crews could see each other's faces through the dust. Soviet tank crews that day were driving T-34s, fast and mobile but undergunned against the newer German armor at long range. Their answer to that disadvantage was brutal in its simplicity. Close the distance as fast as possible. So fast the German Tigers and the handful of Panthers in the sector lost the advantage their thicker armor and longer-ranged guns gave them at range. Soviet veterans interviewed decades later described driving directly at German tanks at full throttle through smoke and dust so thick that visibility dropped to a few dozen meters, engines screaming, gunners firing nearly point blank because that was the only shot that had a chance of penetrating. Tank crews on both sides burned alive inside their own vehicles that day, in numbers that are difficult to state plainly without the words sounding like exaggeration. And yet, every account from people who were there describes exactly that. Burning hulks scattered across a few square kilometers of farmland. Smoke columns visible for miles. The smell, survivors said, impossible to forget for the rest of their lives. This is the part that matters, and I want to say it carefully. Prokhorovka was not won cleanly by either side that day, by the numbers alone. Soviet tank losses were severe in some accountings, more severe in raw numbers than German losses in that specific engagement. If you measured Prokhorovka only by tanks destroyed in those few hours, you could argue the Germans came out ahead. But war isn't decided by a single afternoon's exchange rate. It's decided by what each side can still do the next morning and the morning after that. The Germans, fighting deep inside a defensive system the Soviets had built specifically to bleed them, could not replace their losses in trained crews and frontline armor at anywhere near the rate the Soviets could. Every Tiger and Panther destroyed or disabled in that orchard country was a machine that had taken months to build and years to train a crew for. Every T-34 the Soviets lost could be, and was, replaced from factories in the Urals that had been relocated east of the front, specifically to keep producing tanks no matter what happened to cities closer to the fighting. Stop and think about that for a second. The side that won the tactical exchange at Prokhorovka that afternoon was, in the bigger arithmetic of the war, still losing. That's not a contradiction. That's exactly what attritional warfare against a deeper, better supplied defense looks like from the inside. Here's a question worth sitting with if you've got a moment before we move on. If you were a German tank commander on the morning of July 5th, and your reconnaissance photographs already showed you 8 belts of trenches and minefields stretching back nearly 300 kilometers, would you have pressed Hitler harder to call the whole operation off, the way Guderian did? Or would you have trusted that German tactical skill The same skill that had broken so many Soviet lines in 1941 could break this one too. It's easy for us, 80 years removed and knowing how it ended, to say the answer is obvious. It wasn't obvious to the men making that decision in real time, with imperfect information, command pressure from above, and a war that had already cost their country and their army enormously. History looks inevitable backward. It rarely felt that way forward. I'd be curious what you think you'd have done in their position. It's worth leaving a thought on that in the comments, because reasonable people genuinely disagree about how much was knowable in advance. I want you to think for just a moment about Bruno Formella himself. Not as a footnote, but as a person. We don't have his full story. We don't know what became of him after that interrogation. Whether he survived the war, what he carried with him if he did. What the historical record preserves is a single, narrow fact. A German engineer, doing the quiet, dangerous work of clearing mines in the dark, was caught and under interrogation gave up information that changed the opening hours of one of the largest battles of the Second World War. There is no way to know from the documents that survive whether he gave that information freely, under duress, or some combination neither word fully captures. War rarely leaves us the interior life of the people who shape it. It mostly leaves us the consequence, and the consequence, in this case, was enormous. A spoiling bombardment launched in the dark because of one captured man's testimony against an enemy whose advance depended entirely on the element of surprise they no longer had, into defenses 8 belts deep that had been 2 months in the building. That is the order no one expected the battle to actually turn on. Not a Tiger tank's gun, not a Panther's armor. A sapper, a mine, a question asked. When people talk about Kursk today, they usually reach for the tank numbers first. The thousands of armored vehicles, the apocalyptic scale of Prokhorovka, the sheer industrial weight of the thing. And those numbers are real, and they matter. And the men inside those machines lived and died inside a battle that deserves to be remembered honestly, without exaggeration and without flinching from how brutal it actually was. But if you want to understand why the Germans lost at Kursk, not just that they lost, but why, you have to look past the armor entirely. You have to look at 8 defensive belts dug by exhausted civilians with shovels. You have to look at a strategic argument Zhukov made in April, choosing patience over glory. And you have to look at one captured man in the dark, 2 days before the largest tank battle in history, telling his captors what time the attack would be. The tanks didn't decide Kursk. The digging did. The waiting did. And in the final hours, one quiet, terrified admission in the dark did, before a single shot from a Tiger's gun had been fired in anger. That's what I keep coming back to, in the quiet of trying to understand a battle like this one. The biggest, loudest moments in history are very often decided by the smallest, quietest ones that came just before them. A decision to dig instead of charge. A choice to wait instead of strike first. A single captured man telling the truth in the dark. It's worth remembering that the next time something enormous seems to happen all at once, it rarely does. It's usually been decided already, quietly, by something that happened just out of frame. I'm Arthur Finch. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you'd like to keep talking about moments like this one, there's a link to our community on Telegram in the description below.